Benjamin Wallace had never been one to let emotions dictate his actions. He was a man of logic, precision, and above all, control. As one of the wealthiest men in New York City, his life was a carefully curated routine of meetings, investments, and power moves. But that Saturday afternoon, something inexplicable tugged at him. An invitation to visit a local orphanage had been sitting on his desk for weeks, neglected and ignored. But today, for reasons he couldn't quite explain, he decided to go. The orphanage was a modest brick building nestled in a quieter part of the city. As his sleek black car pulled up, Benjamin felt an unusual tightness in his chest, an unease that he couldn't shake. Dismissing it as fatigue, he stepped out, adjusting his tailored suit as he walked toward the entrance. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, contrasting sharply with the cold autumn air outside. Children's laughter echoed through the hallways, a sound Benjamin hadn't heard in years. The orphanage director, a kindly woman in her 50s named Miss Hampton, greeted him with a genuine smile. "Mr. Wallace, it's an honor to have you here," she said, leading him through the building. "The children are very excited to meet you." Benjamin nodded politely, his mind already wandering. He had agreed to this visit out of a sense of obligation, nothing more. He was here to make a donation, pose for a few pictures, and leave. That was the plan. But as they turned a corner, Benjamin's steps faltered. Standing by a large window, bathed in the soft afternoon light, was a young boy. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with unruly brown hair and piercing blue eyes. The moment Benjamin's gaze fell on him, he felt his breath hitch. It was as if he were looking at a mirror image of himself at that age. Miss Hampton noticed Benjamin's reaction. "That's Lucas," she said softly. "He's a quiet boy, but he has a kind heart." Benjamin couldn't tear his eyes away from the child. Memories, long buried and forgotten, began to stir within him. Memories of a childhood he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. The resemblance was uncanny, down to the smallest detail. The way the boy stood, the slight tilt of his head, even the determined set of his jaw. It was all too familiar. Where did he come from?" Benjamin asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Hampton hesitated, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Lucas was brought here about 3 years ago. His background is unclear. All we know is that he was found abandoned, with no records of his family." The words hit Benjamin like a blow to the chest. He felt his legs weaken, the room around him spinning. The resemblance, the timing, the fact that this boy had no known family. It was too much to be a coincidence. But before he could process what it all meant, darkness closed in on him, and he collapsed to the floor. When Benjamin came to, he was lying on a small couch in Miss Hampton's office, a cold sweat clinging to his skin. She was by his side, a look of concern on her face. "Mr. Wallace, are you all right?" she asked, her voice laced with worry. He nodded weakly, but his mind was in turmoil. That boy Lucas, why did he look so much like him? And why did seeing him trigger such a visceral reaction? As he sat up slowly, a single thought began to crystallize in his mind. He needed to know more about this boy, no matter what it took. Benjamin thanked Miss Hampton for her help, but his thoughts were miles away. He knew he couldn't leave without getting to the bottom of this. He needed to find out who Lucas was and why their paths had crossed in such a hauntingly familiar way. As he left the orphanage, the image of Lucas standing by the window burned into his memory. Benjamin had faced countless challenges in his life, but he knew, deep down, that this was different. This was personal, and it was only the beginning. The drive back to his penthouse was a blur. Benjamin Wallace sat in the back seat of his car, his mind racing with questions that refused to quiet. Lucas. The boy's name echoed in his thoughts, dragging him back to a time and place he had buried long ago. He had always prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize, to lock away the painful parts of his past and move forward without looking back. But today, those old locks had been shattered. The moment he stepped into his penthouse, Benjamin went straight to his study, ignoring the calls and messages piling up on his phone. The room was his sanctuary, a place where deals were made, fortunes were sealed, and secrets were kept. But today, it felt like a prison. He couldn't shake the image of Lucas from his mind. The same eyes, the same face. How was it possible? He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid barely calming his nerves. He hadn't thought about his childhood in years. His mother, Elizabeth, had ensured that he would forget. An elegant woman with an iron will, she had crafted their lives meticulously, erasing any traces of imperfection from their history. But seeing Lucas had torn open old wounds, and memories began to seep through. Benjamin had grown up in an affluent neighborhood, surrounded by wealth but isolated from affection. His father, a man consumed by business, had been a distant figure, more of an idea than a presence in his life. His mother had been the architect of his childhood, dictating every move, every decision, molding him into the man the world now knew. But there was something she could never control: the pain of being unwanted, the ache of being a child who knew too well the emptiness of a loveless home. As a boy, Benjamin had often imagined what it would be like to be free, to escape the suffocating expectations and the cold, calculated environment in which he was raised. He would look in the mirror, wishing he could change the reflection that stared back at him. But now, decades later, that same reflection had appeared before him in the form of a child, Lucas. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that there was more to this than mere coincidence. The need for answers began to consume him, and he knew there was only one place to start. With a heavy heart, Benjamin picked up the phone and dialed a number he rarely used. After a few rings, the line clicked, and a familiar voice answered. "Benjamin, it's been a while." Elizabeth Wallace's voice was as crisp and controlled as ever. "Mother, we need to talk," Benjamin replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "It's about something I saw today." There was a pause, just long enough for him to know she was already wary. "What is it, Benjamin?" He took a deep breath, knowing this conversation would unearth things he wasn't sure he was ready to face. "I visited an orphanage today. There's a boy there he looks exactly like I did when I was his age." Another pause, this one longer, more loaded. When Elizabeth finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its usual calm. "And what does that have to do with me?" "Everything," Benjamin said, the word laced with years of unspoken pain. "I need to know the truth, Mother. Who is that boy, and why does he look like me?" There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, Benjamin wondered if she had hung up. But then, in a tone he had rarely heard from her, one tinged with something akin to fear, she responded, "Come to the house tomorrow. We'll talk." The line went dead before Benjamin could say another word. He stared at the phone in his hand, a wave of dread washing over him. His mother, always so composed, had sounded almost shaken. Whatever she knew, it wasn't going to be easy to hear. That night, sleep eluded him. He found himself pacing the darkened halls of his penthouse, his thoughts circling the same haunting question. Who is Lucas? Every time he closed his eyes, the boy's face appeared, bringing with it a flood of memories he had long since locked away. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the answers he sought weren't just about the boy. They were about him, his past, and the secrets his family had buried. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the city skyline, Benjamin had made up his mind. He would confront his mother and demand the truth. He couldn't move forward without knowing. The mystery of Lucas had awakened something in him, something he had forgotten. His own pain, his own need for closure. And now, there was no turning back. Benjamin arrived at his mother's estate just as the morning fog began to lift, revealing the sprawling grounds he had once called home. The mansion, with its towering columns and manicured gardens, stood as a testament to the Wallace family's legacy, one built on wealth, influence, and an unspoken agreement to never discuss the past. But today, Benjamin was determined to break that silence. As he walked up the stone steps, memories of his childhood flashed through his mind. The endless lessons, the formal dinners, and the suffocating pressure to be perfect. His mother, Elizabeth, had orchestrated it all with meticulous care, molding him into the successful man he had become. But now, as he approached the massive oak doors, he felt the weight of the questions that had been buried for far too long. The butler greeted him with a polite nod and ushered him into the drawing room, where Elizabeth Wallace sat by the fireplace, a cup of tea in her hand. She was the picture of elegance, dressed in a tailored suit, her silver hair pulled back in a tight chignon. But as Benjamin entered, she didn't rise to greet him. Instead, she watched him with a guarded expression, her eyes betraying a hint of unease. "Benjamin," she began, her voice cool and measured. "You sounded rather urgent on the phone. What is this all about?" He didn't waste any time. "I met a boy at the orphanage yesterday," Benjamin said, his tone firm. "His name is Lucas, and he looks exactly like I did when I was his age." Elizabeth's grip tightened on her teacup, but she maintained her composure. "And why should that concern you?" "Because it's not a coincidence," Benjamin replied, stepping closer. "He could be my son, mother, and I want to know if there's something you're not telling me." For the first time, he saw a crack in her icy exterior. She set down her cup with a slight tremor, her eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. "Benjamin, you don't know what you're talking about." "Then explain it to me," he demanded, his voice rising. "Why does this boy look like me? Why do I feel like I'm being haunted by my own past every time I see him?" Elizabeth remained silent, her face a mask of controlled emotion. Finally, she stood, crossing the room to the window that overlooked the gardens. She took a deep breath before speaking, her voice low and guarded. "There are things in this family that are better left buried, Benjamin. You've built a life for yourself, a life of power and respect. Why dig up old ghosts?" "Because those ghosts are affecting me now," he insisted. "I can't just ignore this. You taught me to face challenges head-on, and that's what I'm doing. So, if there's something I need to know, you owe it to me to tell the truth." For a long moment, Elizabeth said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, she turned to face him, her expression softened by something almost resembling regret. "There was a woman," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Her name was Anne. You don't remember her because you were too young. She worked for us, taking care of you when your father and I were occupied." Benjamin's heart skipped a beat, and the name stirred something deep within him, a vague memory of a kind face, a soft voice that had comforted him during his loneliest moments. "She was a good woman," Elizabeth continued, her gaze distant as if she were recalling something painful. "But she made a mistake. She fell in love with your father." Benjamin felt a chill run down his spine. "What are you saying?" Elizabeth sighed, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her. "Your father had an affair with Anne. When I found out, I made sure it was handled discreetly. We paid her to leave, to never contact us again. I thought that was the end of it. But it wasn't, was it?" Benjamin's voice was strained as the pieces began to fall into place. "No," Elizabeth admitted, her voice cracking for the first time. "Months after she left, I discovered she was pregnant. I tried to reach out, to make sure the child wouldn't interfere with our lives, but by then, she had disappeared. I assumed she had taken the money and gone. I didn't know she had given birth." Benjamin staggered back, the truth hitting him like a blow. "So, Lucas is your half-brother," Elizabeth finished, her voice hollow. "I never meant for you to find out like this. I thought I had protected you from the truth." The room spun around him as Benjamin processed the revelation. Lucas wasn't just some random boy who looked like him. He was family, a brother he never knew existed. The implications were staggering. Everything he had believed about his family, about his past, had been built on a lie. "What happened to Anne?" Benjamin asked, his voice shaking. Elizabeth turned back to the window, her gaze distant. "I don't know," she admitted. "I lost track of her after she left. She could be anywhere, or gone." Benjamin ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The revelation changed everything. He couldn't leave Lucas in that orphanage, not now that he knew the truth. But the question remained. What would he do next? For now, there was only one certainty. Lucas needed to know he wasn't alone in this world. Benjamin would make sure of it, even if it meant unraveling the twisted threads of his family's past. The answers he sought were no longer just about his own peace of mind. They were about righting the wrongs that had been hidden for far too long. The drive back to his penthouse was a blur. Benjamin Wallace could barely register the passing cityscape as he gripped the steering wheel, his thoughts spiraling out of control. His mother's revelation had shattered the foundation of everything he believed about his family. A half-brother, Lucas was his half-brother, the product of an affair his father had hidden from the world and from Benjamin. The cold, sterile luxury of his penthouse offered no comfort when he arrived. He stood in the middle of the living room, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The enormity of what he had learned was suffocating. For years, he had lived in the shadow of his father's legacy, believing he knew everything about the man who had shaped him. But now, the truth had twisted that legacy into something unrecognizable. Unable to stay still, Benjamin poured himself a drink, but it did little to calm his nerves. His mind kept returning to Lucas, that innocent boy abandoned in an orphanage, unaware of the storm that had just been unleashed in his life. Lucas had no idea who his father was, no idea that his half-brother was one of the most powerful men in the city. And Benjamin? He had no idea what to do with this knowledge. As he downed his drink, Benjamin's thoughts drifted back to Anne, the woman he vaguely remembered from his childhood. A woman who had cared for him, who had loved his father, and who had been cast aside like a disposable commodity. The more he thought about it, the more the anger simmered beneath the surface. How could his parents have done this? How could they have destroyed lives so easily, all for the sake of preserving their image? He knew he couldn't sit idly by. He had to find out what happened to Anne and figure out how to make things right for Lucas. But where to start? His mother's information was scant at best, and he doubted she would be forthcoming with any further details. With a renewed sense of determination, Benjamin grabbed his phone and made a call to Michael Hayes, his trusted private investigator. If anyone could dig up the past, it was Michael. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Mr. Wallace, what can I do for you?" Michael's tone was professional, but Benjamin could sense the curiosity beneath it. He rarely called for personal matters, and Michael undoubtedly noticed the urgency in his voice. "I need you to find someone," Benjamin said, getting straight to the point. "A woman named Anne. She worked for my family about 30 years ago. I believe she may have had a child, my half-brother, Lucas. I need to know what happened to her." There was a brief pause on the other end before Michael responded. "I'll get right on it. Do you have any other details?" Benjamin hesitated, realizing how little he actually knew. "All I have is her first name, and she left New York around the time I was a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old. My mother mentioned that she might have gone into hiding, so she could be using a different name now." "Understood," Michael replied, his voice steady. "I'll start digging. It may take some time, but I'll find out what happened to her." "Thank you, Michael," Benjamin said, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "Keep me updated." As he hung up the phone, Benjamin felt the first stirrings of hope. For so long, he had been lost in a world of wealth and power, disconnected from anything real. But now, with this revelation, he felt a strange sense of purpose. He had to know the truth about Anne, about Lucas, about everything his parents had tried to bury. Days passed in a blur of anxious anticipation. Benjamin found it nearly impossible to focus on his work, his thoughts constantly drifting back to the boy at the orphanage. He had promised himself that he would not abandon Lucas as his parents had abandoned Anne. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that he didn't just want to uncover the truth. He wanted to be a part of Lucas's life. Then, late one evening, as he sat in his study going over business reports he could barely concentrate on, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Michael. "Found her. Call me ASAP." Benjamin's heart raced as he dialed Michael's number. The call connected almost immediately. "Michael, what did you find?" he asked, the urgency in his voice undeniable. "I traced Anne's movements after she left New York," Michael began. "She changed her name and moved several times, but she eventually settled in a small town upstate. Unfortunately, she passed away a few years ago." Benjamin felt a pang of sadness, and was gone, and with her, the chance to know her side of the story. "What about Lucas?" he asked, his voice tight. Michael paused before answering, as if choosing his words carefully. "Lucas was born shortly after she left the city. She raised him on her own, doing odd jobs to make ends meet. When she passed, he was placed in the state's care and eventually ended up in the orphanage where you found him." Benjamin closed his eyes, the reality of Lucas's life sinking in. The boy had been through so much, more than any child should endure. And all because of choices made by adults who should have known better. There's one more thing, Michael added, his voice hesitant. I found a letter that Anne wrote but never sent. It was addressed to you. Benjamin's breath caught in his throat. What does it say? I'll send you a scanned copy, Michael replied. But to summarize, Anne wanted you to know about Lucas. She was worried about what might happen to him after she was gone. She asked that you look after him if you could, if you ever found out. A wave of emotion crashed over Benjamin, and had tried to reach out to ensure that Lucas wasn't left alone in the world. And now, by some twist of fate, he had discovered the boy just as Anne had hoped he would. Send me the letter, Benjamin said, his voice thick with emotion. And thank you, Michael. You've done more than I could have asked for. As he ended the call, Benjamin felt the full weight of his responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was the only family Lucas had left, the only one who could give him the life he deserved. And he would do whatever it took to honor Anne's wish. Benjamin sat in his study, staring out at the city lights as he waited for the letter to arrive. The path ahead was uncertain, and the challenges were daunting. But one thing was clear. He was no longer just Benjamin Wallace, the powerful businessman. He was a brother, and he had a promise to keep. Benjamin sat in his study, the flicker of the city lights outside casting a faint glow across the room. The letter from Anne lay on his desk, unopened, as if he needed one more moment to prepare himself before facing the words she had written. It had been days since Michael had sent it, but Benjamin had hesitated, knowing that once he read it, there would be no turning back. Finally, he took a deep breath and carefully opened the envelope, pulling out the yellowed piece of paper. The handwriting was delicate, familiar in a way that tugged at long-forgotten memories. As he began to read, the room seemed to close in around him, each word pulling him deeper into the emotions he had buried for so long. Dear Benjamin, if you're reading this, it means you found Lucas. I hope you're well, though I know it's been years since I last saw you. There's so much I wish I could tell you in person, but life has a way of keeping us apart. First, I want you to know that I never intended to disrupt your life. You were just a boy when I left, and I hoped you would grow up without the burden of our family's secrets. But as I got older and as Lucas grew, I realized that there was a part of his life, of your life, that you needed to know. Lucas is your brother, Benjamin. He's the son of a man who wasn't always kind, and a woman who loved him with all her heart. I did my best to give him a good life, to protect him from the shadows of our past, but I've always feared that it wasn't enough. You have every right to be angry, to feel betrayed by what happened. But please, Benjamin, don't let that anger keep you from seeing the good in Lucas. He's a bright, kind-hearted boy, so full of life despite everything he's been through. He deserves a chance to know his family, to be loved by them. I've often wondered what kind of man you've become. If you're anything like the boy I knew, I believe you have the strength to do what's right. I'm asking you, as someone who once cared for you deeply, to look after Lucas. Give him the life he deserves, the life I couldn't provide on my own. I know this is a lot to ask, and I wouldn't blame you if you chose to walk away. But if you do decide to help him, you'll be giving Lucas a future that I always dreamed of for him. Thank you, Benjamin, for reading this, for considering my request. I hope you find it in your heart to forgive and to love him as I have, with all my hope. The letter slipped from Benjamin's fingers, fluttering to the desk as he leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions. Anne's words were a window into a past he had never fully understood, a past that had been hidden from him, yet had shaped the very core of his life. The image of Lucas, his brother, a boy who had endured so much, seared itself into his mind, accompanied by the weight of Anne's final request. But with that weight came a deep, searing anger. His parents had orchestrated this, his father's betrayal, his mother's cold indifference, and the years of lies that had kept him in the dark. And now, after all this time, it was Benjamin who had to pick up the pieces. He had to confront the woman who had raised him, the one who had concealed the truth for decades. Fueled by a newfound resolve, Benjamin grabbed his coat and stormed out of his penthouse. He didn't care that it was late, or that the cold night air bit at his skin as he made his way to his car. All he knew was that he needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to him. The drive to his mother's estate was a blur, the city's lights flashing by as his mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. By the time he arrived, the fury inside him had reached a boiling point. He barely noticed the butler's startled expression as he brushed past him, heading straight for the drawing room where he knew Elizabeth would be. She was there, sitting by the fireplace as she often did, a book in her lap. But when she saw the look on Benjamin's face, the calm facade she always maintained began to crack. "Benjamin," she began, setting the book aside. "What's this about?" He didn't waste any time. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Why did you let me live my whole life not knowing that I had a brother?" Elizabeth's expression hardened, the familiar mask of control slipping back into place. "I did what was necessary to protect this family. You don't understand." "I don't understand?" Benjamin cut her off, his anger rising. "I understand perfectly. You and Father made choices that destroyed lives. You kept Lucas a secret because you cared more about your reputation than about doing the right thing." "Enough," Elizabeth snapped, standing up, her eyes flashing with a rare display of emotion. "You think it was easy for me to make those decisions? To send that woman away, knowing what it would mean for her and for that child?" "Yes," Benjamin shouted, his frustration boiling over. "Because you've always been able to push people aside when they didn't fit into your perfect little world. But this isn't about you, Mother. It's about Lucas. He's just a boy, and he deserves better than this." Elizabeth fell silent, her breath coming in shallow bursts. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Benjamin could see the conflict in her eyes, the struggle between the woman she had always been and the mother she had tried to be. "I know," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I know he deserves better. But I was afraid, Benjamin. Afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. Afraid of losing everything we've worked for." Benjamin shook his head, his anger giving way to something more profound: disappointment. "You've already lost what matters most," he said quietly. "A family isn't built on lies, Mother. It's built on love, on trust. And you took that away from Lucas, from me." Elizabeth looked at him, tears welling in her eyes for the first time in years. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to help me fix this," Benjamin replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "Lucas deserves to know who he is, where he came from. He deserves a chance at a real family, not the one you tried to erase." For the first time, Benjamin saw his mother as something other than the cold, calculating woman he had known all his life. He saw her as someone who had made mistakes, who had let fear guide her decisions. And in that moment, he realized that forgiveness was the only way forward, not just for Lucas, but for himself as well. Elizabeth nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging as the weight of her past choices bore down on her. "All right," she said, her voice barely audible. "I'll help you. We'll do this together." Benjamin exhaled, the tension in his chest easing just slightly. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door, looking back at his mother. "Thank you," he said softly, the words carrying more meaning than either of them could fully grasp. And with that, he walked out into the night, the letter from and clutched tightly in his hand. There was still so much to do, so many pieces to put back together. But for the first time in his life, Benjamin felt like he was finally moving towards something real, something worth fighting for. The next morning, Benjamin stood at the entrance of the orphanage, feeling a sense of purpose that had eluded him for most of his life. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden hue over the city, but Benjamin felt none of its warmth. Today was the day he would confront the truth, not just for himself, but for Lucas. He had to make sure the boy knew he wasn't alone, that there was someone in this world who cared deeply about him. As he entered the building, the familiar scent of old wood and the faint sound of children playing filled the air. It should have been comforting, but instead, it only heightened his anxiety. Miss Hampton, the orphanage director, greeted him with a warm smile, though her eyes held a hint of curiosity at his early arrival. "Mr. Wallace, we weren't expecting you so soon," she said, her voice gentle. Benjamin forced a smile. "I needed to see Lucas. There's something important we need to discuss. Miss Hampton studied him for a moment before nodding. Of course. He's in the playroom. I'll take you to him. The walk down the hallway felt interminable, each step echoing in Benjamin's mind like the countdown to a moment that would change everything. When they reached the playroom, he paused at the door, watching Lucas from a distance. The boy was sitting alone, drawing something on a piece of paper, his small hands moving with focused concentration. "Lucas," Miss Hampton called softly, stepping into the room. The boy looked up, his eyes brightening when he saw Benjamin. He got to his feet and walked over, his steps hesitant but hopeful. "Hi, Mr. Wallace," Lucas said, his voice shy but filled with a trust that pierced Benjamin's heart. "Hi, Lucas," Benjamin replied, kneeling to meet him at eye level. "Do you think we could talk for a bit? There's something I need to tell you." Lucas nodded, his curiosity piqued. Miss Hampton gave Benjamin a reassuring smile before leaving them alone in the room. They sat down at a small table, the room filled with the soft hum of children's laughter from outside. Benjamin struggled to find the right words, his mind racing through 1,000 different ways to start. But in the end, he decided that the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. "Lucas," Benjamin began, his voice steady but gentle, "I've learned some things recently, things about you and about our family, and I need to share them with you because they're important." Lucas looked at him, his eyes wide with innocence. "Okay," he said, his tone unsure. Benjamin took a deep breath, the weight of what he was about to say pressing down on him. "You see, Lucas, I've discovered that you and I are connected. We're more than just friends. We're family." The boy's brow furrowed in confusion. "Family? How?" "You're my brother, Lucas," Benjamin said, the words heavy with emotion. "We share the same father." Lucas blinked, trying to process the information. "But I don't have a father. I don't remember him." Benjamin nodded, understanding the boy's confusion. "I know, and I'm so sorry for that. Our father, he made mistakes, and those mistakes hurt a lot of people, including you. But I want you to know that none of this was your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." The boy's lower lip trembled as he absorbed Benjamin's words. "So, you're my brother?" he asked, his voice small and tentative. "Yes," Benjamin replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "I'm your brother, Lucas, and I promise you, from now on, you won't have to go through life alone. I'm here for you, and I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, Lucas didn't say anything. He just looked at Benjamin, his young mind struggling to make sense of the revelations. Then, as if the truth had finally settled in, his eyes filled with tears. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he whispered, the pain in his voice slicing through Benjamin's heart. Benjamin reached out, gently taking the boy's small hands in his own. "Because they were afraid, Lucas. They were afraid of what might happen if the truth came out. But I'm here now, and I want to make things right. I want us to be a family, like we should have been all along." Lucas looked down at their joined hands, the tears slipping silently down his cheeks. "I always wanted a family," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I thought I was alone." "You're not alone anymore," Benjamin assured him, his voice firm but tender. "I'm here, and I'll always be here for you. We'll figure this out together." The boy's shoulders shook as he let out a quiet sob, the years of loneliness and abandonment pouring out of him in that single moment. Benjamin pulled him into a gentle embrace, holding him close as Lucas cried into his chest. He could feel the boy's pain, the sorrow of a child who had been denied the love and security he deserved. It was a pain Benjamin knew all too well, and in that moment, he vowed that Lucas would never feel it again. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, the world outside the playroom fading away as they clung to each other. For the first time in years, Benjamin felt something shift inside him, a sense of purpose, of connection, that he had been missing for so long. This was what mattered, not the wealth, not the power, but the simple act of being there for someone who needed him. Eventually, Lucas pulled back, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice still trembling. "Now," Benjamin said, smiling softly, "we go home, together, and we start figuring out what it means to be a family." Lucas looked up at him, a tentative hope shining in his tear-streaked eyes. "Really? I can come with you?" "Of course," Benjamin replied, his heart swelling with affection for the boy. "You're my brother, Lucas, my family, and I want you to come home with me." A small, tentative smile broke through Lucas's tears, the first real smile Benjamin had seen from him since they met. It was a smile that promised better days ahead, a future filled with the love and security that had been missing from both their lives for far too long. As they stood up and walked out of the playroom together, Benjamin felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still challenges to face, truths to confront, but for the first time, he knew he wasn't facing them alone. He had Lucas, and Lucas had him, and together, they would build the family they both deserved. Outside, the sun was shining brighter now, the golden light reflecting off the city's skyscrapers. Benjamin looked down at Lucas, who was holding his hand tightly, and smiled. They were on the path to something new, something real. And for the first time in a long time, Benjamin felt truly hopeful for what the future would bring. The following days were a whirlwind of adjustments and emotions as Lucas moved into Benjamin's penthouse. The sleek, modern space that had once been a symbol of Benjamin's solitary, controlled life was now filled with the sounds of a child's laughter, the sight of toys scattered across the floor, and the warmth of a family beginning to form. Yet, beneath the surface, there were still undercurrents of doubt and uncertainty that both Benjamin and Lucas had to navigate. For Lucas, the transition was overwhelming. He had spent years in the orphanage, surrounded by other children, but never truly feeling like he belonged. Now, here he was, in a luxurious home with a brother he barely knew, a brother who had promised to be there for him, but who was still a stranger in many ways. Lucas tried to adapt, but he couldn't shake the fear that this newfound happiness was too good to be true, that it could be taken away just as quickly as it had come. Benjamin, on the other hand, was grappling with the sudden shift in his life. He had gone from being a man entirely focused on his career and maintaining his status to becoming a guardian, a role he had never anticipated. He found himself second-guessing every decision. What to say, how to comfort Lucas when the boy woke up in the middle of the night from nightmares, how to show affection when he had spent so long distancing himself from any vulnerability. One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Benjamin returned home to find Lucas sitting alone in the living room, staring blankly at a book in his lap. The boy's shoulders were slumped, his usual spark dimmed. Benjamin's heart sank as he realized that despite his best efforts, Lucas was still struggling to adjust. "Hey, Lucas," Benjamin said softly as he walked over, trying to keep his voice gentle. "What's going on, buddy?" Lucas looked up, his eyes filled with a sadness that Benjamin wasn't sure how to reach. "I don't know," he mumbled. I don't feel like I belong here. Everything's so different. I'm different." Benjamin knelt down beside Lucas, his heart aching at the boy's words. "You do belong here," he said, trying to convey the sincerity he felt. "This is your home now, Lucas. And I know it's a lot to get used to, but we're in this together. I'm learning too." Lucas glanced at him, uncertainty clouding his expression. "But what if you change your mind? What if you decide you don't want me here anymore?" The fear in Lucas's voice hit Benjamin like a punch to the gut. He realized that no matter how many times he told Lucas that he was wanted, that he was loved, the boy's deep-seated fear of abandonment wouldn't just disappear. It had been ingrained in him through years of being passed over, of feeling like he wasn't enough. "I'm not going to change my mind," Benjamin said firmly, reaching out to gently lift Lucas's chin so the boy would look him in the eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. I'm your brother, and I'm here for the long haul. Whatever happens, we're going to face it together. You and me, okay?" Lucas searched Benjamin's face, looking for any sign of doubt, but found none. Slowly, he nodded, a small flicker of hope rekindling in his eyes. "Okay," he whispered, as if daring to believe it. In that moment, Benjamin realized that words alone wouldn't be enough to convince Lucas that he was truly loved and secure. It would take time, patience, and the consistency of showing up, day after day, no matter what. He was determined to do whatever it took to give Lucas the life he deserved, to prove that he would never abandon him. As the days turned into weeks, Benjamin threw himself into learning how to be the guardian Lucas needed. He found himself doing things he had never imagined, helping Lucas with his homework, attending school meetings, and even learning how to cook a few of Lucas's favorite meals, though the results were often hit or miss. Slowly but surely, they began to establish a routine, a sense of normalcy that had been absent from both of their lives for far too long. But it wasn't just about the small, everyday moments. Benjamin knew that if they were going to build a real relationship, they needed to confront the past together. He decided it was time to bring Lucas to the Wallace estate, to meet their mother, Elizabeth, and to face the history that had been hidden for so long. On the day of the visit, Benjamin could feel the tension radiating from Lucas as they drove through the winding roads that led to the estate. The boy was unusually quiet, his hands fidgeting in his lap as he stared out the window. Benjamin reached over and gave Lucas's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Are you okay?" Benjamin asked, his voice calm. Lucas nodded, though his expression remained tense. I'm nervous. What if she doesn't like me?" Benjamin's heart clenched at the thought. "Lucas, you don't have to worry about that. This isn't about her liking you. You're already family, and nothing is going to change that. We're doing this because it's important for you to know where you come from and to understand that you have every right to be here." Lucas nodded again, but the apprehension in his eyes didn't fade. Benjamin understood all too well. This visit wasn't just about introductions. It was about reconciliation, about bridging the gap between the past and the future. When they arrived at the estate, Elizabeth was waiting for them in the grand foyer, her usual air of authority softened by the uncertainty of the moment. She had always been a woman who commanded respect, who held herself with a grace that bordered on aloofness. But as Lucas stepped into the room, her composure faltered. "Hello, Lucas," she said, her voice more tentative than Benjamin had ever heard it. "I'm Elizabeth, your grandmother." Lucas shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking between Benjamin and Elizabeth, unsure of what to say. Benjamin stepped forward, placing a hand on Lucas's back to steady him. "Mother, this is Lucas," Benjamin said, his voice steady but carrying an unspoken plea for her to be gentle. "He's been through a lot, and this is all new for him." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes softening as she looked at the boy who was now a part of her family. "Lucas, I'm so glad to finally meet you," she said, her tone sincere. "I know this must be overwhelming, but I want you to know that you're welcome here, always." Lucas bit his lip, still uncertain, but he managed a small nod. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Elizabeth reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "I hope we can get to know each other," she said softly, her voice carrying a hint of the vulnerability she had rarely shown. "I've made mistakes in the past, but I want to make things right, if you'll let me." Lucas looked up at her, his young face etched with a mixture of fear and hope. He had been hurt before, had learned not to trust too easily, but something in Elizabeth's voice made him want to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Benjamin watched the exchange, his heart full of emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. This was what he had been fighting for Lucas to have the family he had always deserved, for the walls that had kept them apart to finally come down. And though the journey was far from over, he knew they were on the right path. The afternoon passed in a series of small but significant steps. Elizabeth and Lucas talked, slowly at first, but with growing ease as they found common ground. She showed him around the estate, pointing out the gardens and the rooms that held memories of Benjamin's childhood. And as the day turned to evening, Benjamin noticed that the tension in Lucas's shoulders had begun to ease, replaced by a quiet curiosity about this new world he was now a part of. By the time they left the estate, the air between them felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Lucas seemed more relaxed, more at ease with the idea that he wasn't just a visitor in Benjamin's life, but a permanent part of it. As they drove back home, Lucas turned to Benjamin, a small smile playing on his lips. "I think I'm going to like it here," he said, the words tentative but hopeful. Benjamin smiled back, his heart swelling with pride and relief. "I think you will too," he replied, reaching over to ruffle Lucas's hair affectionately. "This is just the beginning, Lucas. We've got a lot to look forward to." And in that moment, As they drove through the quiet streets, Benjamin felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He had found redemption in the most unexpected of places, in the heart of a young boy who had given him a second chance at family, at love, at life. The road ahead might still be long and uncertain, but for the first time, Benjamin knew he wasn't walking it alone. Weeks passed, and the bond between Benjamin and Lucas grew stronger with each passing day. Their lives were slowly starting to resemble something that felt like family. Benjamin was no longer the distant, stoic figure he had once been. He found joy in the small things, helping Lucas with his homework, sharing meals, and even watching movies late into the night. The once cold and pristine penthouse was now alive with laughter, warmth, and a sense of belonging. But despite the growing connection between them, there was still one lingering shadow that neither of them could fully escape: the absence of their father. Lucas never asked about him directly, but Benjamin could sense the unspoken questions hovering between them. For Lucas, the concept of family was still a fragile thing, and the mystery of his father loomed like an unaddressed wound. Benjamin had spent years burying his own complicated feelings about the man who had shaped his life in so many ways, both good and bad. His father had been a titan of business, a man admired and feared by many. But at home, he had been a distant figure, more concerned with his empire than with his family. And now, with Lucas in the picture, the need for answers was more pressing than ever. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the topic surfaced unexpectedly. They had just finished watching a movie, and the credits were rolling when Lucas, who had been unusually quiet throughout, finally spoke. "Benjamin," he said softly, his eyes focused on the flickering screen, "do you think we'll ever get to meet him?" Benjamin knew instantly who Lucas was referring to, and the question hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been dreading this moment, but he knew it was inevitable. "Our father?" Benjamin asked gently. Lucas nodded, his expression tentative. "Yeah, I know he's not here, but I just wonder what he was like. Why he wasn't in my life." Benjamin exhaled slowly, the weight of the question settling heavily on him. How could he explain the complexities of their father's choices to a boy so young, so full of hope for answers that might never fully satisfy? Benjamin began, struggling to find the right words. "He was a complicated man, Lucas. He made decisions that hurt a lot of people. But I don't think he ever meant to hurt you, or me." Lucas looked at him, his eyes wide with curiosity. Then why didn't he stay? Why didn't he want to be a family? Benjamin felt the old bitterness rising in his chest, but he pushed it down. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about Lucas, and the boy deserved more than anger and resentment. "I think he didn't know how," Benjamin said honestly. "Our father was a powerful man, but he wasn't good at being close to people. He was always focused on his work, on his success. And sometimes, when people get lost in that world, they forget what's really important." Lucas frowned, his young mind trying to grasp the complexities of the situation. "So, he wasn't a bad person?" "I don't think he was bad," Benjamin replied, choosing his words carefully. "But he wasn't there for us the way he should have been. And that's something I wish I could change. But, Lucas, what I want you to know is that you don't need him to define who you are. You're already more than enough. You've got a family now, and we're going to make sure that you never feel alone again." Lucas was quiet for a long time, absorbing Benjamin's words. The boy's eyes were thoughtful, and Benjamin could see the gears turning in his mind as he tried to reconcile the absence of the father he had never known with the family he now had. Finally, Lucas looked up at Benjamin, his voice soft but resolute. "I guess I don't need to meet him. I have you." The simplicity of the statement nearly brought Benjamin to tears. He reached over and pulled Lucas into a tight embrace, feeling the boy's small arms wrap around him. "Yeah, you do," Benjamin whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got me, and I'm not going anywhere." But even as he held Lucas, Benjamin couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more he needed to do. He had spent so long trying to forget his father, to distance himself from the man's legacy. But now, with Lucas by his side, he realized that facing the truth about their father was the only way to fully move forward. The next morning, Benjamin made a decision. He would take Lucas to their father's grave, to finally close the chapter on the past and offer the boy the closure he deserved. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but it was time to confront the man who had cast such a long shadow over their lives. A few days later, they drove out to the cemetery, a quiet, secluded place on the outskirts of the city. The sky was overcast, the air thick with the promise of rain. As they walked through the rows of headstones, Lucas held tightly to Benjamin's hand, his grip firm and steady despite the uncertainty that hung in the air. When they finally reached the grave, Benjamin felt a strange mix of emotions wash over him. The headstone was simple, elegant, just like the man it honored. Jonathan Wallace, beloved husband and father. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Benjamin stared at the inscription, feeling the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between him and his father. The years of silence, the unresolved anger, the lingering questions, none of it seemed to matter now. What mattered was the boy standing beside him, the future they were building together. Lucas was the first to break the silence. "So, this is him?" he asked, his voice quiet. Benjamin nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, this is him." Lucas stared at the grave, his expression unreadable. "I don't really know what to say," he admitted, glancing up at Benjamin. "That's okay," Benjamin replied softly. "You don't have to say anything. I think sometimes it's enough just to be here." Lucas nodded, his brow furrowing in thought. "Do you think he knew about me? Like, really knew?" Benjamin hesitated, then answered honestly. "I'm not sure, Lucas. I wish I could say yes, but I don't know. What I do know is that if he had known you, if he had taken the time to be a part of your life, he would have been proud. You're a good kid, and anyone would be lucky to have you in their life." Lucas looked up at Benjamin, his eyes filled with something akin to hope. "Thanks," he whispered. They stood in silence for a while longer, the wind rustling the leaves around them as they shared the quiet moment of reflection. Benjamin felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace that had been elusive for so long. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly letting go of the anger, the resentment, the guilt. He couldn't change the past, but he could build a future, one that was free from the weight of old wounds. As they turned to leave, Benjamin placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You ready to go home?" he asked, his voice gentle. Lucas nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Yeah, I'm ready." They walked back to the car, the clouds overhead beginning to part just slightly, allowing a sliver of sunlight to break through. It wasn't much, but it was enough, a sign that, despite everything, there was light ahead. As they drove away, Benjamin glanced over at Lucas, who was staring out the window, lost in thought. The boy was quiet, but there was a sense of calm in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. For the first time, Benjamin felt like they were truly moving forward, together. The past was behind them now, and though it had shaped who they were, it no longer had the power to define them. They were free to write their own story, and Benjamin knew, without a doubt, that the best chapters were yet to come. The weeks that followed their visit to the cemetery were marked by a quiet but profound shift in both Benjamin and Lucas. There was a sense of peace that had not been present before, a softening of the unspoken tension that had once lingered between them. The past, with all its secrets and heartaches, had been faced, and in doing so, they had opened a door to the future, one that neither of them had imagined, but one they were now ready to embrace. Lucas had begun to thrive in ways Benjamin hadn't expected. His once hesitant smiles had grown wider, his laughter more frequent, and the quiet boy who had been unsure of his place in the world was slowly becoming more confident, more secure in the knowledge that he was loved, that he belonged. Every day, Benjamin saw pieces of the boy's true spirit shining through, a spirit that had been buried under years of loneliness and uncertainty. One afternoon, as they sat together in the park, watching the autumn leaves fall around them, Lucas turned to Benjamin with a thoughtful expression on his face. "Do you think we're going to be okay?" Lucas asked, his voice quiet but steady. Benjamin glanced down at him, surprised by the question, but touched by the sincerity behind it. "I know we will be," he replied, smiling softly. "It's going to take time, but we're figuring it out, one day at a time. And we've got each other, right?" Lucas nodded, his eyes searching Benjamin's face for reassurance. "Yeah, we do." There was a comfortable silence between them, the kind that only comes when two people have moved beyond the need for constant words and explanations. They didn't need to say it out loud, but both of them knew. They were building something real, something lasting. For Lucas, it was the family he had always longed for. And for Benjamin, it was the chance to be the person he had never known he could be. A brother, a protector, someone capable of love and devotion. That night, back at the penthouse, as Lucas worked on his homework at the kitchen table, Benjamin found himself reflecting on how far they had come. He had never imagined that his life could look like this, filled with the day-to-day challenges of raising a young boy, with moments of joy and frustration that came from caring about someone other than himself. And yet, despite the ups and downs, there was a deep sense of fulfillment that came from knowing he was making a difference in Lucas's life. The knock on the door that evening was unexpected. Benjamin frowned slightly as he crossed the living room to answer it, wondering who it could be at this hour. When he opened the door, he was met with the last person he expected to see, his mother. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, looking more vulnerable than Benjamin had ever seen her. Gone was the perfectly composed woman who had controlled every aspect of their lives. In her place was someone older, more fragile, and, most surprising of all, someone seeking reconciliation. "May I come in?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Benjamin hesitated for only a moment before stepping aside. "Of course," he said, ushering her in. Elizabeth entered the penthouse, her eyes taking in the warmth of the space that had once been so sterile and cold. She glanced over at Lucas, who was sitting at the table, watching the exchange with cautious curiosity. "I wanted to talk," Elizabeth began, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I know I haven't been the mother you needed, Benjamin, and I haven't been the grandmother Lucas deserves, but I've been thinking about everything, about the choices I made and the consequences of those choices. And I realized that I don't want to lose you, either of you." Her words hung in the air, filled with a raw honesty that Benjamin had never heard from her before. He could see how hard it was for her to admit that she had been wrong, to let go of the pride and control that had defined her for so long. And as much as he had wanted to stay angry with her, to hold on to the resentment that had built up over the years, he found that he couldn't. Not anymore. "Lucas," Benjamin said gently, turning to the boy, "why don't you come over here for a minute?" Lucas hesitated, clearly uncertain about what was happening, but he slowly rose from his chair and walked over to where they stood. Elizabeth looked down at him, her expression softening. "Lucas, I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I should have been here for you. I should have done more to make sure you knew you were part of this family. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I'm ready to be here for you now, if you'll let me." Lucas looked up at her, his eyes wide with surprise. He had heard Benjamin talk about his mother, about the complicated relationship they had, but he had never expected her to say these things, to apologize, to ask for a place in his life. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. But then, in the simple, honest way that only a child can, he nodded. "Okay," Lucas said, his voice quiet but full of meaning. "We can try." Elizabeth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She knelt down to Lucas's level, reaching out tentatively before placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more to me than you know." Benjamin watched the exchange, his heart swelling with emotion. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a grand, dramatic reconciliation, but it was real. It was a beginning. And for the first time in his life, he felt like they were all on the same page, moving toward something better. As the evening wore on, they sat together, Benjamin, Lucas, and Elizabeth, sharing stories, talking about the future, and finding moments of connection that had long been missing. The years of distance and misunderstanding were still there, but they were beginning to bridge that gap, one conversation at a time. Later, after Elizabeth had left and Lucas was getting ready for bed, Benjamin stood in the doorway of the boys' room, watching as Lucas carefully tucked himself in. "Are you okay?" Benjamin asked, his voice soft. Lucas nodded, looking up at him with a smile. "Yeah, I'm okay. I think we're going to be good." Benjamin smiled back, his heart full. "Yeah, kid, I think so too." As he turned off the light and closed the door behind him, Benjamin felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The journey that had begun with so many questions, so much uncertainty, was finally leading them to a place of healing, of love, of family. And as he stood there in the quiet of his home, Benjamin realized that this life with Lucas, with the people he loved, was the life he had been searching for all along. It wasn't about the wealth, or the power, or the legacy. It was about the simple, profound joy of being there for the people who mattered most. In the end, it wasn't the past that defined them. It was the future they were building together, one day at a time. If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.